good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. This is an update on the goings on in Zimbabwe. We still haven't heard anything about SADC meeting to finalize the decision on the SADC, the damning SADC electioning observer team report of the Zimbabwe elections of 23rd August 2023. It is taking too long, to be quite honest, for them to decide. But some good news to report. The European Union has withdrawn its support of the Zimbabwe government, says US 17.5 debt arrears clearance. And they've made it very clear they're withdrawing it because Zimbabwe failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections in the August elections. So the pressure is piling up. And I think rightly so too. But the lifting of the withdrawal of the support is sparked off the usual debate on are sanctions doing more harm to the ordinary people. This has been a futile debate, but I think it is worthwhile revisiting it. I would like you to hear argument on sanctions made by the Patriotic Front, the ZANU-PF and PF-ZAPU in 1978. And they got one of probably Zimbabwe's best known and articulate speaker, Edson Robo, to present the case at the UN. Let's just listen to what he has got to say.
The fact that Smith has no intention to abandon his racist domination of the African people in Zimbabwe leaves us with no option but to intensify the armed struggle. While the Smith regime continues to employ various tactical maneuvers to subvert moves towards genuine independence, dangerous and unrealistic ideas are being thrown about by the United Kingdom government. These dangerous ideas include promises to lift economic sanctions on condition that Smith allowed little more token powers to his black collaborators, and plans to create a corridor through which an evacuation of white people could be mounted.
Now our demands, Mr. Chairman, this committee should be sensitive to the new imperialist intrigues in the months ahead. The rigged elections should be denounced in advance because they have been rigged in advance. The United States Congress interference should be condemned. Sanctions should be intensified, and all members of the illegal regime, black and white, should be barred from entering any member state of the United Nations. As for the Patriotic Front, Mr. Chairman, we want to give your committee a pledge. We promise this committee that we will now go flat out to smash the Salisbury regime by escalating our armed struggle.
I'll stop there. So in this particular case, there was absolutely no argument that the sanctions were justified. Now, withdrawing this aid is once again being seen, oh, yeah, these sanctions is going to make life difficult for the ordinary Zimbabweans. I find this ridiculous. I think it is important that maybe we have a quick analysis of the situation here. If we were to look at the sanctions and ask ourselves two questions. Which of the following three problems are behind Zimbabwe's economic meltdown? Number one, corruption. Number two, mismanagement. Number three, sanctions. And number four, other causes, such as drought, etc. And if we're going to go to the second level and ask ourselves, who would we say is attributing to those problems? And I'll again pick four main actors here: Zimbabwe's ruling elite, the Western foreigners, ordinary Zimbabweans, and others, including the Chinese, SADC, etc., etc. In my personal analysis, I would say that corruption contributes at least 45% of Zimbabwe's economic meltdown. And when did it start? I would say corruption started soon after independence. ZANU-PF's economic policies were always geared on making the ruling elite comfortable. Yes, at the beginning, their appetites were not that much. But as with time, they started to grow exponentially. The second one, mismanagement, I would say it contributes 30%. And that too started soon after independence. The third, sanctions. I will attribute 5%. And we should remember here that sanctions were only imposed in 2001. And then other causes, 20%. And those would have started way back 1980. As for the contribution of each, I would say that ZANU-PF, Zimbabwe's ruling elite, particularly ZANU-PF, have contributed 70% to corruption. In other words, they are responsible for 70% of the corruption. It is their responsibility. Mismanagement, I would say 70% again. Sanctions, I would say 65%. Others, 50%. We cannot deny that the government of the day carries the responsibility on us to determine which direction the nation is going. So most of the problems that we have in Zimbabwe, that we've had these last 43 years, can be attributed to those in power, in government, ZANU-PF. So you find, at most for the corruption, I've said 70%, and for other causes, 50%. Western foreigners, particularly those who imposed the sanctions, to corruption, I would say they've contributed zero. Can't think of anything that they have done to contribute towards corruption in Zimbabwe. The same applies to mismanagement. Sanctions, yes, the West are the ones who imposed the sanctions. So I would say they contributed 30%. I say 30%, which is less than what I attributed to ZANU-PF, which is 65%. Because as much as the West imposed the sanctions, we cannot deny that one of the causes, at least as far as the ordinary Zimbabwean is concerned, for asking for the sanctions are no different from the argument that Edson Zobro was presenting in the video we just watched in 1978. The sanctions were imposed to put pressure on the ZANU-PF ruling elite to hold free, fair, and credible elections. The reason why ZANU-PF has lasted 43 years is because the party has been rigging elections. That is at the heart of it. And therefore, then to impose the sanctions to say you must hold free, fair, and credible elections makes sense. Ordinary Zimbabweans, what's our contribution towards corruption? I would say probably 20%. Mismanagement, another 20%. Sanctions, I don't see how we can say we've contributed anything to sanctions. I know ZANU-PF propaganda machinery has wanted to attribute the sanctions to the opposition leadership. I find it laughable that the same regime, when it suits them, have dismissed the MDC leaders as puppets of the West. And yet, when it suits their narrative, they have blamed the MDC leaders for imposing sanctions, for the sanctions that were imposed by the West. As far as ZANU-PF is concerned, now suddenly the opposition are the ones telling the West what to do. I think that is a lie. When have we ever heard of a puppet controlling the puppeteer? During the GNU of 2008-2013, Morgan Tsvangirai and his colleagues were on record calling for the lifting of sanctions. And the West ignored them. Why? Because the West said ZANU-PF has not changed. It's still the same oppressive, tyrannical regime. And rightly so too. ZANU-PF had not changed at all. It's just that the opposition in their naivety thought ZANU-PF changed, when in reality they had not changed. So I would attribute 0% influence of ordinary Zimbabweans, including the opposition, on sanctions. So this argument that the ordinary people are putting so much time arguing for the lifting of the sanctions when their influence is 0, and yet their influence on the government of the day is 20%. Why are you not spending your time influencing the government to end corruption and mismanagement, where you have got influence? And yet, you like walking up and down the street demonstrating against sanctions, over which you have got absolutely no control. I think it becomes even more emphatic when you look at the issue of sanctions being imposed because ZANU-PF is failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections. If before independence, we justified the UN sanctions, which were more stringent, and I believe that the effects of the sanctions on the ordinary person was much more than the 5% I attributed it here. For the simple reason that corruption and mismanagement during the white regime, those were unknown factors, or there was very little corruption going on in mismanagement. And this is why, in fact, regardless of the war that the white regime was waging, the economy continued to be so strong. The infrastructure, when we gained our independence, was still there. So in this particular case, the sanctions percentage was much higher, and yet no Black person across the divide, even not only in Zimbabwe, but even in South Africa and other Black countries, argued against the imposition of sanctions on the white minority regime, for the simple reason that, yes, they caused the hardships, but people also appreciated that this was a necessary sacrifice for the country to end the white colonial oppression. I think the more so now in Zimbabwe. As much as ZANU-PF would want this announcement by the European Union to be considered sanctions, I don't think it is. Because surely we cannot say the European Union must help us pay off our debt. It is our debt. Why should the European Union be obliged to pay it? But I would go one step further and call on the European Union that in the face of what we are facing in Zimbabwe, if, for instance, if SADC, the election, were to ignore the damning election report and grant ZANU-PF legitimacy, I think the European Union should revisit the sanctions. The European Union has lifted most of the sanctions that it had imposed on the ZANU-PF regime. I think they should revisit them and reimpose them. And this time, make sure that they bite. I do not think any thinking Zimbabwean would consider a sacrifice of 5% of the economic hardships the sanctions are causing as worse than the 75% contributed by corruption and mismanagement. If we do not address the issue of corruption and mismanagement in Zimbabwe, the country is going nowhere. Even if all the sanctions were lifted, the country will still go nowhere. I therefore would like to see or to invite the European Union to seriously revisit the issue of the sanctions and make sure that they bite. If the SADC leaders should let the people of Zimbabwe down and endorse the ZANU-PF regime as legitimate, Zimbabwe cannot afford another 5 years of this corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical ZANU-PF regime, the country is already a failed state. And as long as it remains a pariah state, nothing is going to change. We have seen corruption go up by leaps and bounds. In February this year, the whole world listened to the Al Jazeera Gold Mafia documentary. It is shocking that such blatant mafia rigging can happen at such a vast scale, at a governmental level. We are now looking at institutionalized looting. If Mnangagwa and his colleagues are allowed to get back into power and given another 5 years, I honestly don't see how things are going to change. They have bankrolled the ZANU-PF regime during these elections. And they'll be looking at the next 5 years will be to recoup on their investment. The looting will not stop. And the last thing Zimbabwe wants is that the looting should continue. Because as long as ZANU-PF has got so much money, I think we'll be looking at 2028. I don't see how it can be different. In fact, if SADC was to sweep under the carpet the present damning election reports by both SADC and the AU, it will only give confidence to ZANU-PF that they can do the same again and get away with it. So when is this going to stop? When is this circus going to stop? How are we going to stop this circus? Other than increasing sanctions on the regime. I welcome the European Union's decision to withdraw its support on the Debt Arrears Clearance. And I hope that if SADC should make the mistake of endorsing the regime, the European Union will revisit the sanctions that they lifted on the regime, the view of imposing them and including a few other people on that list, and making sure that those sanctions bite. I totally agree with Edson Sobro's argument. It was valid in 1978. It is even more valid now because we are facing the same dilemma. I totally reject this argument that because it's now a black government, somehow we've got to pretend that the oppression does not have the same effect. It has the same effect. The people of Zimbabwe are living in abject poverty because of 43 years of gross mismanagement and rampant corruption. The right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country is at the heart of good governance. And that is what has been lacking in Zimbabwe. So in conclusion, I think I'll just play again a bit of Edson Shobo's argument on why the UN should impose sanctions on the Smith government. And close with that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now our demands, Mr. Chairman. This committee should be sensitive to the new imperialist intrigues in the months ahead. The rigged elections should be denounced in advance because they have been rigged in advance. The United States Congress interference should be condemned. Sanctions should be intensified. And all members of the illegal regime, black and white, should be barred from entering any member state of the United Nations.
With that, I would like to close tonight's discussion, and thank you very much for listening. Have a good day.